Well, good evening.
Good evening.
What a nice buzz in the room that I'm a little sad to interrupt, but I'll say one more time, good evening. My name is Dr. Jessica Joustra, and I serve here at Redeemer as the director of the Wolters Center for Christian Scholarship. And I'm just delighted to see you all this evening. I'm so grateful that you're joining us here for our final installment of our Wolters Center lecture series for the 2024-2025 academic year, our social sciences lecture. Welcome. These lectures are a part of the work that we do here at Redeemer, where all of our work confidently proclaims that God's work in his world, in his original creation, in Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, and in his coming restoration, we proclaim that it's a comprehensive work, one that reaches to every nook and cranny of creation. It is, to use my favorite theologian's language, Herman Bavinck, a joyful tiding, not only for the individual person, but for humanity, for the family, for society, for state, for art and science, for the entire cosmos, for the whole groaning creation. In all our work here, including the work of these lectures, we at Redeemer want to excavate and explore the way the gospel pulls us, draws us, shapes us, fashions us towards God's will and way in creation, in all of creation. So we ask questions like, what does it look like to witness to the lordship of Jesus Christ and his coming kingdom in our scholarship and study? How do we affirm the ongoing good in God's world while rejecting the distortions and twistings of sin? One of the gifts of the center is thoughtful Reformed Christian scholarship that directly seeks to answer these kinds of questions for every discipline. We have in-house faithful teachers and scholars who also, in this lecture series, join with leading scholars outside Redeemer to help us think about these central and difficult questions. We're going to look at one today. And so this is the work of these lectures, to drill down into particular disciplines, to unpack some of the insights that a distinctly Reformed approach can bring to the questions and challenges of our day. And so this evening, it's my privilege to introduce you to our Wolters Fellow in the Social Sciences and in Business, Dr. Vahaga Satrian, who is a professor of business and economics here. And he's going to help set the stage for our evening tonight.
Good evening again. Thank you, Dr. Joustra, for your introduction. Indeed, I'm very excited to introduce our lecturer tonight. Dr. Foreman serves as professor of social work and as dean for the social sciences at Dordt University in Iowa. Very dear place for myself, as I did my master's and doctorate not too far at Iowa State from where you are located. Abby teaches courses on social welfare policy and administration. For example, she teaches a course titled Church, State, and Social Welfare, where students explore Christian traditions and the views on the role the state, the church, and the community should play in responding to the needs in their communities and in the world. In her dean role, she facilitates opportunities for faculty to deepen their Reform perspective as it relates to their teaching and scholarship in their discipline. Previously, she has served as a faith outreach organizer for the Christian anti-hunger advocacy organization, Bread for the World. In her role as an organizer, she worked to equip church and college groups, teaching about key policy efforts to address hunger, poverty, and HIV/AIDS in the US and around the world, and how they can use their Christian voice to advocate for the vulnerable people. Dr. Foreman holds a PhD in political science with an emphasis in public administration from the University of South Dakota. She has a master's in social work degree from the University of Michigan and a bachelor's in social work degree from Dordt University. Dr. Foreman's interests include the role of church, state, and community in responding to need, and explores the relationship between government and non-for-profit partnerships in contract for services relationships. As you can see, the title of her speech tonight is Sharing Responsibility, Getting Creative in Responding to the Needs of the Vulnerable. Now, typically I don't get paid for these events until I facilitate the discussion question, but But today I had a privilege and of asking my dear colleague and esteemed professor of social work, Dr. Jim Vanderwer, to facilitate this discussion, partially because, as I understand, there is a mysterious professional overlap that has connected the two dear friends here. I also recognize that while I invited the students, I forgot to distribute the pre-generated questions to ask of our speaker, but I hope you will be inspired. I trust you will be inspired by the lecture tonight, and well, there's always ChatGPT, right? On that positive note, Dr. Foreman.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. It's been just really a privilege to be asked to be with you throughout the day and this evening as well. When I looked a little bit into this opportunity, I said, oh, Al Wolters, I recognize that name. So Wolters has been instrumental in my own perspective, development of perspective from a reformational worldview, first as a student at Dordt University a few years back, and then also in my work developing and helping to develop new faculty as they become more immersed into working at a Reformed university and what does that mean. And so Dr. Joustra articulated what that means to live a life fully understanding the place that we have in that world. So it's an honor to be here. I've also been very influenced by Dr. Jim Vanderwer. He was my professor just a few years back at Dordt. And during his time as my professor, he opened up the world to me a little bit, especially with his insights into neo-Calvinism or neo-Kuyperianism, however you want to term it, and social welfare. How do we understand this world that we live in, especially as social workers? And he really helped to shape my understanding and my further development of that reformational worldview. So these foundational influences led me in graduate school at a public secular university to head to the library and go to the stacks and seek out that guy, Abraham Kuyper, who I remember hearing maybe too much about in my undergrad. And I wanted to come back because I was being confronted with worldviews that were quite different than mine, which was good stuff to be confronted with, to work through, but also just to be able to understand what is it that I believe about the world and God's role in this world, and how do I understand that? So I climbed up into the library there and found Abraham Kuyper once again. And that helped me to, again, be reacquainted with that transformative and all-encompassing worldview that equipped me to engage well with my classmates and colleagues, many of whom thought very differently than I did. But I could do that with confidence, being able to do that together, respecting them, and in turn having them respect me as well. So I'm very grateful to be here and for the opportunity tonight to get a little bit nerdy about social welfare and the role of government and nonprofit organizations. And so this has been fun to put together as I've been able to think about both academic understanding of organizations, our society, and the role of government, and then also to connect that with reformational thought. And so that's really what we are going to be taking on here this evening. So the purpose of this, or the thesis, is that creative responses to the needs of the vulnerable are essential in our world. And biblical principles and contemporary thought are helpful for us to understand where we're at and where we might go. And so that's really what we're going to get into this evening. As we think about where we're at in the overall biblical narrative, We're in that time period of the already and the not yet. And yet we know, especially as it's articulated by Wolters and others, that we're not headed back to the Garden of Eden, but actually there's a direction and there's development in our world. And so how do we understand that, right? We can't necessarily turn our backs on it. We can't just roll our eyes. We're a part of this world. So how do we understand it? And that's what we'll be able to take a look at this evening. And we'll start by looking at the biblical basis for caring for the vulnerable. In the Old Testament, God gives various commands on how to live in community with one another to the Israelites. These commands outline the plans for a just and merciful community where all may flourish. It recognizes vulnerability as a reality in communities, especially this side of the second coming. And God suggests that we put into place then protections for those who are vulnerable. In the Old Testament, he gives instruction to the Israelites. These Old Testament commands include insights into equality of opportunity by instituting ideas like the year of Jubilee or debt relief. And it's also incorporates opportunities for the poor to provide for themselves through practices like gleaning, where people can go and pick from the fields and provide for their families by grain that's been left behind. Both justice and mercy are biblical concepts, and we talked about that a little bit if you were in chapel this morning with Micah 6 verse 8. So how do we figure out what we do in this? There's so many biblical passages that talk about the importance of caring for the vulnerable. And Nicholas Wolterstorff talks about this term, the quartet of the downtrodden, the poor, the widow, the orphan, the stranger within your community, and that these are the four groups that are mentioned time and time again in the Bible to point out these groups are going to need your help. You should put into place ways to help them, structures, laws, policies, whatever it may be. And these are the ones that we should continually be focusing on. And that message continues in the New Testament as well. We see Jesus make it clear, whatever you do for the least of these, you do for me, in Matthew 25, and James continues as well. True religion is this: look after the orphans and the widows in their distress. So the biblical message is clear, and yet using these biblical principles doesn't make it any easier for us to figure out what to do in our contemporary context necessarily. Conversations about social welfare, social services tend to be kind of emotionally and politically challenged and charged, in part because it's really a conversation about collective responsibility. So it's not about my responsibility, but it's about our responsibility to each other. And that makes it more complicated. Within the realm of collective responsibility, we can parse these actors, the groups that might get involved, into a couple different big categories. One would be government, so state types of activities, and the other civil society, which can include nonprofits, community groups, congregations, all being active in that space. And so we talk about this and we try to determine how and should we be involved, what is the best way to do that. And it's often a very difficult conversation for us to have with one another. We have different views on this, right? Depending on our political leanings and all of that, it's just a complicated thing for us to talk about together and figure out where to go. So in the midst of all that, we have maybe a bit of a setup of it should be the government providing these, for the needs of those who are poor and vulnerable, or maybe it should be civil society. Maybe we've got a little bit of a dichotomy that's created in that. But I want to talk a little bit about what I've sensed being a part of social services as a practitioner or professional, and then also as an academic as well. So what exactly are we looking at? And that is actually something that I probably took about 10 years to explore. And I'm going to use myself as an example here in my own story. In the early 2000s, I graduated with my newly minted Bachelor of Social Work degree and my pair of fresh khaki pants, which was, what every professional wore back in the 2000s. And I went out and I said, okay, I'm going to get my social work job. And so I applied for jobs, and I was interviewed for 3. And the first was with Catholic Social Services. And this job was to do kind of child protection work, family preservation work in West Michigan. That's where I was looking for jobs at the time. The second job I applied for and was interviewed for was with the Salvation Army as a worker in their coalition to end homelessness in West Michigan. And the third one, which is the one that I ultimately ended up with, was with Lutheran Social Services as a service coordinator, working with low-income people who were living in subsidized housing. All of these jobs, if you were to look up at the screen here and their logos, would say, well, each of those are faith-based organizations, and that's true. Each one of those positions that I was applying for are jobs that were funded by government contracts. So in this, I'll explain a little bit more about what was happening there. You have, for Catholic Social Services, it was the state of Michigan that was contracting with Catholic Social Services to help with child protective work. Both Salvation Army and Lutheran Social Services were contracted through the federal agency, Housing and Urban Development, to provide services to secure housing in the case of the Homelessness Coalition, and then also to prevent early admission into long-term care facilities for seniors, which ultimately is a cost savings to the state as well, and the overall government. So all of these, again, were within the context of a faith-based organization, and yet the money was coming from a governmental initiative and project that they have. And I have one more up here, which is an interesting one as well. So I worked then later for Bread for the World, which we talked about that a little bit earlier here. And this one, my position was actually funded by Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So a billionaire essentially funded that position. And so he was interested, and still is very interested, their foundation is very interested in equipping organizations around issues of public health, like AIDS and global poverty around the world. And so they at the foundation gave money to Bread for the World, a Christian organization, to be able to help to equip Christians to talk to their elected officials about global AIDS, hunger, and poverty. Okay, this is really kind of interesting, right? We got governments funding things and billionaires funding things, all under what looks to us like faith-based organizations, and which definitely were. I'm not questioning that at all. All of these organizations utilize this contract or grant funding from the organizations, and many, many do. For most nonprofits, the biggest funder to what they do, whether that's victim services, child protective work, community-based work, is often actually coming from the funder, which would be some sort of state or federal funding, or perhaps from a foundation like the Gates Foundation. And so I didn't really question it at the time, right? I'm in my new khaki pants and I need a job. I don't care where it's coming from. Somebody's going to give me a paycheck. But over time, it's like, that's kind of interesting. All of these jobs had different types of accounting requirements for me to write down my activities and how many people I talked to, all of which was in the name of accountability. And I started to notice this as well as I moved into the academic world, that there's a misunderstanding, or we're missing it quite often, when we don't understand the interwoven and interdependent relationship between governmental actors and nonprofit organizations. So the growth of the government and nonprofit sectors and their increased interaction together through these contracting relationships really is something that we need to understand, and we need to be aware of the implications for it as well. So we'll spend a little bit of time on that. Academics have come up with a few terms for this. So you've got the government funding a lot of things, and then you've got contractors out there doing this, who are other agencies completely. How do we understand this? One of the things that they use to describe this, a few terms, is that this could be considered government by proxy. So it's close to the government doing the things, but it's not the thing. Third-party government or indirect administration, or one that's maybe a little critical in nature is the hollow state. So this actually moves things out of what the government does. So within all of these, you have a change in terms of how we might understand this, and then what exactly are the responsibilities in this. So as I moved into into academic work as a professor and as a scholar, I went into my PhD program wanting to ask a question that continues that theme of what am I looking at here? What I have not had a helpful frame where anybody has explained this to me very well. What is this thing, right? And so I went into my dissertation work attempting to get at some better answers for this for myself. And a few things became very clear. The government and the voluntary sector are dependent on one another in the social service sector. And as each grows, they become more interactive with each other and more interdependent. The contracting relationship has really shifted the role of government, which we'll talk about later. And nonprofit service providers view their work when they're working as a recipient of a contract. They view themselves as partners, as stewards in the work, working together with those, which is kind of a minor point, but that actually goes against what some of the original academic theory thought about how this worked, where they thought definitely that people were much more at odds in those positions. And so we found, I found and other people found as well, that it's not necessarily like that actually there's much more collaboration involved, although of course there can be exceptions in certain relationships. So what's become clear to me in this is that there's not necessarily an either or, that you can say it's government that should do this or it's church and community that should do this. But it's actually more of a both and in terms of what this looks like currently and what should be. And so we'll look a little bit more at that as we get going here. Traditional accounts of social welfare history, as I've learned it in classes and so on, often focus very much on the role of the development of the government and its bureaucratic functions to be able to distribute resources, and that is really when things started to roll, right? Things started to happen for vulnerable people. But there are a few competing narratives out there and others who say, well, I don't think that's the full story. Certainly there was something there, and there was big things that happened as governments grew and as countries became better off in terms of quality of life, and so they expect more things, and who's going to provide the things that they expect. And so in that, others have argued, and I would agree, that alongside that always has been a growth in that nonprofit, faith-based sector, community-based sector that has grown as well, to be able to respond to need in their communities and to be able to provide for people in that space. So for the last century or so, maybe, we can say that there's been evidence that both of these groups have grown and that they're really involved with one another. So as we talk about this a little bit more, we're going to go in two different directions. First is to think about academic thought on this issue, and then we will look at reform thought and how it can help shape and inform our views on shared responsibility. So there's a quote that I put up on the slide so that you can kind of read it as I talk here, and we'll focus in on a few different parts. But I wanted to give you an introduction into this specific idea that comes by way of something called new public governance. So it's an emerging conceptual framework, so it's relatively new, at least in academic terms, probably in the last 20 to 30 years, which helps to characterize government and social services providers as co-producers, where the emphasis is really more on relational and cooperative work together than it is on the contractor having the control, and then everybody else has to just listen to what they say. And again, this comes out of what people are actually seeing and what they're looking at. And it's a bit of a corrective from new public management, which came about specifically around in the 1990s and led to a global movement that changed how governments work in these spaces. So there was an argument that we should introduce market-based principles into the work of government. We should introduce performance-based measurements and competitive bids so that we can reduce waste and inefficiencies. Maybe some of this is sounding a little bit too much like the news at the moment when we talk about reducing inefficiencies. But the point with new public management was, again, to recognize that there needs to be a focus on outcomes. It can't just be about, well, here's the activities we're doing, right? If I'm writing down how many phone calls I'm making, maybe that matters and maybe it doesn't. What am I making the phone calls for? What's the outcome? And so in the field, there was a lot of tallying of activities that didn't necessarily meet up with the outcomes that we were hoping for. So new public management in the 90s sort of leads to this change in most of the developed countries in terms of how they operate in contracting relationships. New public governance comes along a little bit later to say, yeah, a lot of that is still there as well, except for we actually think that the role between government and nonprofits is much more on an equal plane than probably we had thought before. And if that's true, then it changes what the government should be doing in these relationships, or the nonprofits should be doing together in these partnerships. So we'll come back to that a little bit in just a moment. And now we're going to move, there we go, not too far, into reform thought on pluralism and public justice. So I believe that the new public governance and even some elements of NPM, new public management, line up very nicely with principled pluralism as it is articulated by many in the Reform tradition. I have a quote here by Corwin Smith. So public or principled pluralism serves to explain and accept the diversity evident in public life. That this recognizes different structures of authority that operate within different spheres of social life. And that provides a basis for opposing both totalitarianism and individualism. So that's been a key worry for Kuyper and others as well, when they look at the state and the role of the government, to say, we need to make sure that's limited in terms of that activity. And how do we do that? How do we keep that limited? Pluralism gives us a way forward in that by recognizing legitimate authority from other actors, other organizational actors in this case. So principled pluralism accepts the state as a social structure possessing legitimate authority, but it sees other social structures as possessing legitimate authority within their domains of human and social life. So a limited but legitimate role of government, and perhaps more importantly, there's an acknowledgement of other social structures that also have legitimate authority. Again, if you think back to that narrative of, well, the government, and then are these little, faith-based groups doing little church stuff out there, hardly worth talking about. But then you think about those faith-based organizations doing so much work at a large scale, and that's a different type of thing that we need to pay attention to. So contracting relationships hold power and authority of the government check through interdependence required between that contractor and the vendor. As extensions of the community and the associational life recognized by Kuyper and others, nonprofit organizations are affirmed as social structures to which God has delegated authority to promote human flourishing. Creation continues to unfold through the task that people have been given to bring to fruition the possibilities of development. And so this is important to think about the context of where we're at. Could this would this have looked the same if this rolled out in the same time that the government was being built into a bureaucracy with sort of welfare state characteristics? Probably not. But we're in a different space and we're in a different time, and our understanding and our framework of development helps us in that place. Vandermeer, in his article and his keynote speech at the North American Christian Social Work Convention, articulates it this way: humans build not only physical things, but also social organizations, practices, and institutions. Societies evolve and change over time through human imagination and intervention. Social forms and entities that exist today did not exist yesterday and may not tomorrow. Such variation is understood to be part of God's plan for his creation, albeit distorted and stunted by sin and human failing. Nevertheless, the differentiation and development of societies are not seen as diverging from God's will, but rather an unfolding history of God's kingdom in which humans play a primary role. In that same vein, Jim Skillen, offers a normative framework for understanding civil society that's useful here as well. So his 4 main points are up on the screen here, but the key idea here is that there is an important allowance for diversity of how things unfold in creation, and that the important part of that is to really think about that outcome, and in this case and in our belief system is justice. It's flourishing, it's shalom, and that's what we should be working for in that way. With number 2, the proper exercise of the particular and necessary responsibility to govern an open, densely occupied, and highly interactive public square allows us to think also that things should not necessarily just, maybe it's better if not just one group does it, that there's an allowance for people to think differently about it and to approach things from a different place. Number 3 talks about resisting reduction of people and also resisting the reduction of organizations to a mediating function. So there's much written about how a civil society provides a mediating between the government, who's going to overreach, and business or the market that's going to overreach. So we've got to have our human associations in the middle. And that is important. It's an important part of a healthy human society, but yet that's not the only thing. And so he argues here that we need to think more fully about what that is and how we are able to live in that space. In that final point, the proper interlinking of all institutions and relationships in a just society, Skillen points us to consider direction. Like with all things in a created world, there are aspects of our current social welfare structures that point towards just living and flourishing, and other aspects that certainly move us away from that. What Skillen describes as proper differentiation of organizations opens up that imaginative space for us to consider a variety of institutions and organizations that can be involved in bringing about healthy communities. So the overarching question for us then that must be on our hearts and minds as Christians is whether activities contribute to human flourishing at the individual and especially at the organizational level, as we discuss it today, and societal level. So if we're okay, and I'm not saying you have to be okay with it, but if you're okay with accepting that there's a lot of interwovenness between what all of these different actors are doing when it comes to social services, how do we understand the role of these specific big sectors here? Both Reformed and academic thought are clear that the government in this situation has unique and special tasks. First, Kuyper and others argued that the state has a protective role to play, to uphold the boundaries between the spheres, and to ensure that the rights and responsibilities of other spheres of life are not violated. An example of this is very clear to see in child welfare. So you have a family, right? And that's a sphere that we talk about, a family. that has rights and responsibilities to care for a young child, to protect them, to bring them up in the ways that they should be, and that's the parent's responsibility in the family sphere. However, we live in a fallen world, and parents sometimes fall short. And we have developed systems and legal systems that say when that's the case, the government is justified in coming in to violate the boundary of that sphere to ensure the protection of that child. Right, so that's a really clear example of how that happens, and that's a part of the role of government, that they have that as their legitimate authority in that case. From the academic side, many who study interwoven and interdependent relationships and social welfare make a point that in a sort of bureaucratic hierarchy, command and control really makes a lot of sense. We say this, you do this. We're going to make sure you do this. And we have compliance and accountability measures to make sure you do that, even though maybe that doesn't make sense on the ground, right, in your local community. And there's no way in a formal bureaucratic system to say, this doesn't work for us. Actually, would like to try something different here. Could we try this because of the groups of people we're working with or our geographic location? And in the old system, there's really no way to account for that. There's no way for there to be flexibility in how those groups operate together. And so the academic theorists have been arguing in public administration to say they need to move away from that as their responsibility and view themselves as network coordinators. So people who are building bridges between community actors, providing funding, capacities, all of those sorts of things, to be able to get things done on the ground. In a book called Bridge Builders, How Government Can Transcend Boundaries to Solve Big Problems, Kettle and Egger talk about the fact that we probably have outgrown the usefulness of bureaucracy as a way to solve problems. That in the last 100 years, it has solved the problems that it can. But there are a lot of what they call wicked problems, which isn't a judgment call necessarily, just more like these are tricky problems to try to solve and entrenched. And with these problems that are over a bunch of different sectors, we actually need a different type of management. We need a different type of coordination instead of we have decided this is how it should work, and so therefore you go out and do this work. So they argue for collaboration. They argue for partnerships to work together. One quote in the book says, instead of the moonshot, right, getting to the moon and putting together all these things to get to the moon as a project together, we should maybe think of it more like buckshot. So instead of, one shot, you've got a spraying of shots so that you can actually attack a problem from a number of different directions and from a number of different strategies. So in that, we should also be aware that organizational tools should be tools and they should not be roadblocks. So if there is something that's in place that doesn't make sense, maybe onerous training for foster care parents, for example, how do we address that? How do we change it so that it is important and timely and all of those things? In line with reformational thought in this category, there can also be opportunities for creative and responsive opportunities to develop new ideas. We see that all the time in our development organizations where they try new things, where they invest in small businesses at low interest loans and microfinance and things like that, where they're able to try because they're really freer to be able to do that. And so they can be creative and they can think differently about problems in their own context. And in this case, then the role of the government is really not to be the creator, but it's to encourage the creativity, to invest in that, to provide incentives for people to think differently about problems and to be able to get things solved. In Bridge Builders, they talk about this quote, or this is a quote from there. No complex problem can really be addressed by a single entity. Effective outcomes are co-produced based on trust between each other, a clear objective, and unity of effort. As Christians, we know that problems really won't be solved this side of the second coming, but we do know that we're invited into that work and that we're a part of that. So we can't just shrug and say, well, yeah, I mean, we'll just wait for to go to heaven. That's not our call or not our responsibility. That's an important thing for us to keep in mind. And through the cultural mandate, we're given certain tasks to perform. So some of us may be more directly involved in this, and others, maybe it's more of a support that we do this. And that's not our professional work day to day. But the importance of that creative, innovative approach to solving problems cannot be lost because we have complicated problems. And so I think we need to own our own agency and being able to try things, to focus on the outcomes, to make sure that we're getting where we think we should be going, and try, if we're not getting there, try something new, and that there should be freedom for that in our relationships, especially as they relate to governmental agencies as well. Responding to needs comes from local, community, and often faith-based organizations. And for those leading in those spaces, in our churches and communities, we should really commit to collaboration, to commitment of outcomes, and creativity and innovation. These groups have advantages of having more freedom to be creative, and they can respond in more relational ways than other organizations. And we may be likely to focus on specific aspects of the problem. So if you're not trying to solve the whole problem, maybe you can just solve a slice of the problem. And that's okay if you recognize a differentiated, diverse view of the organizational actors in place. Only by means of the normative development of each institution and organization simultaneously and together can a healthy and just society be sustained and further developed. In this, we know that God has invited us in as co-laborers with him. So neither the one who plants, from 1 Corinthians 3, so neither the one who plants nor the one who waters is anything, but only God it's only God who makes things grow. The one who plants and the one who waters have one purpose, and they will each be recorded to their own labor. For we are co-workers in God's service. You are God's field, God's building. In this, we see that conversation, that invitation really to be a part of what God is doing here in his redemptive work. We also, through new public governance and some of those ideas, can see that this academic group has also thought of it in the same sort of way, that there's co-production that happens between a number of different groups in human organizations as well. But one thing that we can be clear on is that even as we're invited into this work, we're not the key person or entity that decides. The Lord is on his throne. And so we can take rest and assurance in that, that we're invited into work and we're a part of that redemptive process. But we ourselves are not Superman, and we as a group are not the heroes, but rather we're invited in as co-producers. And so that really is that key idea of shared responsibility in social services. Thank you.
Okay. All right, we get to sit. So thank you so much. Oh, is it on?
No, it is. There we go. Thank you so much for that. That was great. In fact, I get a real sense of hope just from listening to you talk in the context of the world that we're in, the week we're in, the day we're in, these sorts of things, right? And I think, just as you concluded, that God has called us to be part of his work, but he doesn't actually need us. He could do it without us. but he actually invites us to participate in that work. But the thing is, he's going to do the work. It's going to get done, and you can count on that. And so I think that what you've described is sort of a little bit of a glimpse of not just our capacity for imagination, but how we actually image God in his enormous creativity and sort of, all this complexity that really, I think, speaks to his imagination as well. So this is just great. And of course, it's also sobering because we have to remember that what we're talking about is people who are hurting and experiencing a lot of difficulties. And I know it can seem like when you're talking at a kind of a high level in terms of government and all these different processes and policy that we can become distant from real people, but we can't lose sight of the fact that there's actual people who are hurting. We know many of them, we come into contact with them. Many of you out there will have that own experience. And so we don't want to lose sight of the humanity of that. And that's also a significant challenge. So thank you so much for that. We're going to have a little bit of a conversation. We'll hog the mics for a little bit, and then we'll open it up for questions for the rest of you. So I really appreciate how you've kind of given us a sense of both what does the academic literature kind of tell us about these kind of models of governance and kind of the complexity of thinking not just of government as the big provider and nonprofits as being kind of minimal, but they're kind of working together. And I think you're quite right. Sometimes that can be looked on as negatively. I've heard other phrases like contracts for hire, right? And that they're kind of co-opted. There's that whole dimension of that question, which you kind of allude to. What does it mean when a faith-based organization takes money from government? Does that change them in some way? Will the requirements that government imposes test the faith and the mettle of people in the organizations to stay true to their mission? That's a significant question, and it's not the easy thing to sort out. And so when we look at some of the examples of Catholic Charities, Lutheran Social Services, and others in closer to home, we've got CARES Disability Services, who have kind of showed us how to navigate that fine line between taking the public money but not being kind of changed and kind of losing sight of your Christian mission. So there's a lot going on there as well.
Yeah, and unfortunately, the historical story there for most is that many of them that took government funding, especially in the middle of the 20th century, lost
Absolutely.
their mission fit, or they sort of became generically human service related. We see parallels actually with universities in the same
Exactly.
in that
Yeah.
same way as well.
Yeah, there's this tendency to become absorbed by and changed and then essentially secularized to the point where there's nothing left of the faith in the organization but the name. And you click about us, you go to history, and you say, oh, they were Christian, but they're not anymore, right? And so that's, I think, a casualty of this contracting thing, that it behooves then leaders in those organizations to think very carefully about how do we keep ourselves from being kind of swallowed up by this sort of monolith that government contracting can do, because it ends up being a chase for the money.
Yes.
That's the challenge, of course, right? Like, do we go for this grant or do we not, right? So there's a significant challenge there. So a couple of questions that I have. I really appreciate your sort of focus on civil society, and I think you're quite right that it acts as a kind of a mediator between government, between the market, between sort of society as sort of a collective versus society is made up of individuals and so on. But civil society is a complex thing, and it's made up of a whole host of organizations, churches we've mentioned, businesses, labor unions, sports teams, faith-based organizations, communities, families, and so on. I'm wondering if you have a sense of, in this sort of new public governance model, are there institutions that are kind of missing from that participation, or missing in terms of their engagement, that we should be alert to, and what might be done to kind of bring them in to become more active?
Hmm. What I think maybe some sociology reports or studies have shown is in some ways that maybe I can't identify one, but that there is something missing for many people. That's just that association and connection with others. So in my class, I often talk about like if you care deeply about bird watching, do you want to start a club? You know, get together with other bird lovers. I mean, you know, like that's association. It doesn't have to do with your politics, your religious beliefs. You can associate on those things too, but just that general activity with other people in your communities is seemingly decreasing quite significantly. So Robert Putnam in early 2000s wrote a book called Bowling Alone, which sort of shows the decrease in bowling leagues, which seems like a weird thing, but actually that's important, right? You go out and you bowl with others, and you're just on a team. You compete with others in this sort of fun way. And he points to it and says, "We're losing this part of our interaction with each other." And you know, I know even from when I grew up, there was a lot of church softball leagues and things that people just got together and did something for fun. And just engage with one another. So that seems to be just missing, that relational piece where people are connecting with those outside of their friend group, outside of their immediate family, outside of maybe their work. Even I've seen studies lately that people don't even feel like they have work friends anymore. So like this isolation has continued to increase. I think it was exacerbated during COVID, but it has not let up for some people.
Yeah, if he was gonna do a new edition, it might not be Bowling Alone, but Bowling Online. Right?
Yeah.
Right, and so you have virtual but disembodied connections, which don't address that sort of relational, the importance of relational development, and don't address the loneliness component. So that's another part of it. Yeah.
And as more people move away from being part of a local church, you lose that group that's just watching out for you.
Yeah.
You know, the one who's bringing you a meal after you have a baby, or checking in with you after somebody in your family died, or you can go to church and be with other people, and maybe that's the only time you really have that in your life. And so as people move away from religion, there's the belief aspect of that, the salvation aspect of it, but it's also like, well, then who are your people?
Right.
And people don't. And the one thing, the beauty perhaps of church life is that you take care of people whether you like them or not, right? So even if somebody annoys you, you still might bring them a meal, right? Because that's what you do as part of being part of church. So people have lost those networks that are based on your friendship with somebody too, I think.
Yeah. You mentioned a number of times that that what we're looking to try to do is to bring about flourishing, and we talked about pluralism in terms of kind of a variety of different kinds of structures and entities. But what about the pluralism of differences of belief, which is sometimes referred to as confessional pluralism? And the reason I wonder about that is that we can all say that we want flourishing, but you actually get quite different definitions based on someone's sort of ultimate confessions about what that flourishing looks like. So somebody might say, well, flourishing for me is leave me alone and let me be online. That's flourishing. Now, you or I might disagree, but if this is what someone says is flourishing to me, then I define it. So I guess what I'm wondering is, how do we get to work towards sort of shared understandings of what flourishing actually is across these substantial differences?
Yeah.
Yeah, if you have the answer,
Yeah.
I'd be really amazed because I don't know either, but I'm just curious.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One thought I have there is that if we're gonna say, Smith says it, that there's diversity evident in public life, then there's diversity evident in public life.
Mhm.
And so that means that diversity is there, and that may mean that we create and open up spaces that are free for people to pursue a bit of their own definition of flourishing.
Mhm.
And I do think that if we want to bring in maybe a concept like common grace, where God extends his grace to all of creation and to people, that we can maybe work towards shared understandings of certain aspects of what the good life is. We probably can't get to a definition we're all going to sign off on, but I do think that we are able to discern goodness together through common grace that can help us, in our sort of basic human life to be able to do that.
Yeah, and so I agree with that, and I think that the challenge, of course, is for Christians to be able to articulate their vision of flourishing in a way that actually resonates with people who are of different faiths or backgrounds that they can agree with. So we have to learn the language of those around us and not be in our sort of faith silo or whatever, which is
Yeah.
challenging.
Yeah.
Right.
We've talked a lot recently about hospitality. And what does hospitality mean? Does that mean you just open your doors and say, well, you're welcome in? Why aren't you coming in? Is that hospitality? Or is hospitality actually a more active,
Right.
like you're understanding where somebody's coming from? You sort of set the table in a certain way, knowing that someone who's coming is vegan. And you've asked that question so you know who's coming to your table rather than just, serving meat and potatoes or something. So that's been an interesting conversation too. What does it mean to be hospitable to others? Is it just, you're welcome here, come on in? Or is it a much more intentional getting to know someone and their experience as a part of that?
Yeah. I wonder about something else that maybe gets to kind of the underbelly of some of this, and that is that in the working together towards flourishing and trying to address vulnerabilities and so on, you've got sort of government actors trying to do the networking and bridge building and so on. You've got other sort of agency people trying to do the same thing. How do we account for sort of built-in kind of power differentials in those things? So I remember something that was quite striking to me early in my career, where I was working in a low-income community and I was trying hard but failing to kind of be like them, kind of thing, right? And so this one person that I was working with said, "You're not fooling us." Like I was wearing jeans and a sweatshirt and that kind of thing, and she said, "You're not fooling us," right? So there's a kind of a class-based professionalization that comes with working in that environment that misses out on some realities of people who live with certain vulnerabilities, partly because of these power differentials. So what do we do about that reality?
Yeah. I think ideally you would have responses that are aware of those differences. So sort of more from a grassroots, here's what we're going to do about this in our neighborhood or in our community. And this accounts for, the uniqueness of our neighborhood or this group of people. And here's what we're going to do. And then on that contractor side or that networking side, for there to be a fair amount of, okay, you've shown us that your outcomes, these are your outcomes, what you're trying to do here, and we think it's a good idea. But there is definitely power there and difference. Obviously, whoever has the money our system, that's what it said. You know, if you want to compete for this, we want to see you addressing trafficking there. So they can move the needle to some extent that way as well. I don't know. That can go one way or it can go another way.
Right.
So whether that's the best way to do that. But,
Yeah. All right, I have one more question, and then I'll invite some questions from the rest of us. If you're familiar with Andy Crouch's book, Playing God, he talks a little bit about the power of institutions and so on. One of the things he comments on is that when we're working in these different organizations or when we're working in a government, we're part of these human institutions, and we bump up against sort of, there's the ideal about what they're supposed to do, and then there's what people actually do. And so there's hurt and betrayal and selfishness and so on. And he has this lovely way of talking about that. He says that Christians have to take up their tasks as trustees of institutions. Trustees have seen and borne the worst that institutions can do. And yet they've somehow escaped the abyss of cynicism. Instead, they enter into the life of their institutions, bodying a better way, bearing the institution's pain, and offering hope. Which I just think is really striking because the institutions are made up of humans, and so they're not perfect, of course, right?
Yeah.
So I guess I'm just wondering if you have any kind of comment about that insight or any reaction.
Yeah. In one of my classes, we do this little educational exercise where I ask the students, I say, okay, write down as many words as you can about the Super Bowl. So they write down, chicken wings and guacamole and halftime show and all of these things. And so then I have them go bring it up on the board, and then I say, okay, but what is the Super Bowl? Oh, it's a football game, actually. That's what the Super Bowl is, but it's not actually. It's taken on all of these other things, which my point is that that's kind of what happens with an institution. It's more than just the sum of its parts. It has essentially a life of its own. It definitely does, actually. It isn't dependent on one person, and so one person can leave and the thing keeps going. Or a number of people can, and it will continue to go as well. But I think that we can participate in fallen institutions, organizations, structures with our eyes wide open, very aware of times where it's fallen short, where mistakes have been made, where people have been treated unfairly, with the mind that we continue to work to make it better. And so we don't throw it out, not revolution, but reformation.